Nå er jeg på. Ja, hei. Haha. English. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on how and why to make your research data fair. Now, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And it has become almost like a mantra in science and research these last few years. But what does it really mean, fair? What does it mean to make your data fair in practice? Now, to start us off, to open the ball, so to speak, we have our very own rector, Professor Svein Stølen. So welcome.
Takk. I keep it there, because then I can follow my sort of manuscript. First of all, Daryl, I'm very happy to be here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this science library and to the University of Oslo, and also to this event about open science. Especially warm welcome to our main speaker, Barend. Yep. I forgot to ask you your connection with Svalbard and Barentsburg, but I can ask you another time. Yes, must be something. The Go Fair initiative is at least extremely important and interesting. And I'm sure that we will be able to learn a lot from what you're doing and your work on open science policy and implementation. I believe it's important that the initiative is bottom-up, as far as I understand. I believe that's always important at a university, because it's, I know, as a rector, it's not that easy to put things top-down at the university. It shouldn't be that easy. Active researchers should play a central role, and I think that's a key success factor. I also liked one of the previous reports on open data from the EU system called Riding the Wave, because it was extreme on the focus on the user-friendliness of the systems. They wanted something that the researchers almost couldn't see. It should only work. And I think that's a good way to have a vision about what we are going to do. After the launch of the Plan S, the open access debate has been quite intense here in Norway. Isn't that true, Alexander? Last week we had a very good event on the same stage here in the library. Director of the Norwegian Research Council was here, and many of our excellent researchers, among them Alexander, who is one of the advocates for open access. There were also some on the other side during this small discussion for a couple of hours. As many of you, academic freedom at the University of Oslo is also interpreted to include the freedom to choose publication channel. That's a part of our open access policy today. And for that reason also, there have been some really heated discussions. We need to understand the opposition, and we need to look for clever solutions to the challenges that Plan S is giving us. But Plan S is giving the direction which we absolutely agree on. But when discussing open access, there are, of course, many different subjects you can go into. But if you broaden the scope to open research and science, you get even more possibilities, of course. Some basic facts remain. Digitalization has revolutionized how we conduct and publish research. It has also changed how the public interact, engage, and use research. It has changed the relationship, for example, between the medical doctor and the patient. Myself, I had some retina displacement at some point. I could go into the web and find all information, so I could challenge the medical doctor when I had my surgery. Between teacher and student, of course, between public and universities. And this is important, of course. At the University of Oslo, we do have rather, I believe, clear guidelines for open research data, and we support the FAIR principles, of course, wholeheartedly. However, like many institutions, we must admit that the transition to open science has been rather slow. The transition to open access has been rather slow. So we need to speed up. But I believe we are on the right path, And I'm sure we are also going to learn a lot from the Go Fair initiative. And I'm promised the slides because I have to go to another occasion after this short introduction. When we talk about open science, from time to time we could get the impression that it's a type of one-way communication. Researchers getting ever more data that we can give out to the public. But of course, I think it's important to stress that it's also a question on involving with society and with citizens, to have interaction. I'm eager to see university interacting more with other knowledge actors in society and also with the public, of course. I believe this will make the research more relevant, and it will also ease the degree of taking knowledge into use, contributing also to public trust and understanding of research. But of course, there are many ways to do this, and I have to mention, since we are in this particular week, yesterday we opened the Oslo Peace Days. That's also a kind of communication of research that is important to University of Oslo. We have 8 days with events connected to peace, human rights, and democracy. Extremely important, of course. And talking about everything with open science and so on, we should remember this type of activity as well. That's extremely important to the University of Oslo. We can also involve the public directly in research, of course. We have some great examples at the University of Oslo. Natur i endring, Changing Nature, is a project at the Natural History Museum together with the Faculty of Mathematics and Natural Sciences in cooperation with the Norwegian Tracking Association, where they try to involve people to register the tree line in Norwegian mountains. That's a way to engage the citizens, of course. On the same line, I should also say that it's not always necessary to engage the public, I believe. So we have to be a little bit careful. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But we should try to engage with community stronger than we have done today. And most likely, I believe, we're now at a tipping point where the transition to open science is accelerating, going faster. That's good. But there are some challenges, and I will point to one. And then we are related to user group involvement and citizen participation, because we should be careful with the academic freedom that we have at university. Could use my own research as an example, doing disorder in inorganic materials, all sorts of theoretical models. It's impossible to involve, I would say, public in such a topic. They are not interested. And we have to make sure that when we develop different type of systems for founding research and so on, we should be careful not to put too much emphasis on this kind of interaction where it's not necessary. I think that's also always interesting for health type science. How are you going to find a balance between what is done close to the patient and what is more long-term type of research? And another example is probably that if we had asked public back in the 60s, when Ole Johan Dahl and Kristen Nygaard started to do their work on informatics, I think we would get relatively limited support from the public. Still, this was the foundation for object-oriented programming. That is really the foundations for the whole digitalization and the new society. So we have to find a balance here all the time. There are always some dilemmas, and that's typical for everything we do at a university, most of what we do at the university. So I believe that researchers must play a key role, both in the policy development and in the implementation plans. That goes for Plan S, and that goes for open science in general. Flexibility and taking into care the different traditions of different disciplines will be important. But if we are able to really engage with the scientists, I'm sure we are going to turn the system around and be much more open, as we should be. So making life a little bit difficult here with my comments, my aim is really to point out some of these dilemmas that I think we have to take seriously in order to succeed with what we want to achieve, and that is open science. So I think that's my introduction. I'm sorry I can't stay here today. I have to go back to human rights. And we are today going to celebrate 101 new PhD students taking their PhD in the aula. And that's, of course, one of the most important ways in order to transform knowledge into society. So good luck with the meetings, and I get reports afterwards, I'm sure. Thanks.
All right. Our next speaker is a bit of a superstar, really, when it comes to FAIR, Professor Barend Mons. Now, he's a professor of biosemantics at the Department of Human Genetics at Leiden University. He is also leading the International Support and Coordination Office of the Go FAIR initiative. And today, he is going to tell us about his own experience as a researcher and how this has influenced his work with Go FAIR and the European Open Science Cloud. So, welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Can you switch source? So thank you for inviting me and this very nice, almost overdone introduction. Although let's not talk about me, but FAIR has really taken a stardom. It's taken the world by storm. Maybe now that you say that, I can start with a statement of Mark Howell, the CEO of Figshare, who said it was my favorite word in 2018, but also the most abused word. And I will go back to that because lots of people have their own interpretation of FAIR, and I will talk about that later. Let me start with introducing myself a little bit. I'm a molecular biologist, worked for 15 years on malaria, then went into bioinformatics. And that's the very short story of my career. And then at some point we decided, and I wrote my first article about this in 2015, so that's 13 years ago. It was called "Which Gene Did You Mean?", wherein I basically said, you know, computers will now be our major research assistants and we publish and communicate science that in a way that is a nightmare for them. So if we want computers to help us much more efficiently, we better start to publish our data in machine-readable format. So that was the whole idea behind FAIR, not just for humans. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for machines, and therefore also much better for people. That's another story. Now, based on the FAIR principles, I'm sure, I was asked in 2015 to be the first chair of the high-level expert group on the European Open Science Cloud by Robert Jan Smits. I didn't put the slide here, but I said I hated all four terms. I already said that this morning. It's not open, it's not European, it's not open, it's not just for science, and it's definitely not a cloud. So we will try to find out today what it is, but that is two Dutch people together, we have to be blunt, of course. So, but I already explained that this morning, and I don't want to repeat that. But what we said, we actually redefined the EOSC as the European contribution to something that is by definition global. That's what I said. It's not European. Science is global. It's the European contribution to something that we call the IFDS, the Internet of Fair Data and Services. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And if you want to follow the Internet approach, we have to follow the same route as the Internet. That developed in the 90s, as you know, with minimal standards, the hourglass model, TCP/IP and domain names in the middle, and total freedom to operate, voluntary participation, rough consensus, running code, bottom-up, as the rector said, not some big, you know, governed stuff thing from Brussels or anywhere. So we say aim at the lightest possible internationally effective governance. We also had many other things, but that was one of our major recommendations. Only guide where that is due. And you have minimal rules of engagement and protocols. And then the other recommendation was federate the gems across the member states, which means build on networks of excellence of users that already know what they're doing. They already built some infrastructure components, bring them together, and basically repeat the trick of the internet many times, because the only way NSFNet could work in the United States in those days was, according to the current director, or the then director, George Strawn, who is now 78 and still my advisor. He always calls me a young man, so that's interesting. So he said, the only way this could work is that we only said TCP, IP, and domain names. We didn't tell anyone else what to do. We said, we choose TCP, IP, forget all the discussions about OSI, and he even had to sign that he would switch if that was ready. We just do it this way. But 100 universities and NSF behind it had enough critical mass for everyone to flock to it, and that's where the internet boomed. So minimal standards, don't tell anyone else what to do, but have critical mass. So in GoFair, we are trying to bring networks of excellence together that each in their own area, like the C Data Cloud or GBIF, or have a critical mass and say, if we make a choice, most likely other people will join. I'll try to explain that a little more. So what we are actually experiencing at the moment is a real paradigm shift through a evolutionary bottleneck from human-oriented science communicated in papers. I don't care about articles anymore. Machines don't like articles. They hate them. I will come back to that later. Then we go to this Internet of Fair Data and Services, or if you want, the Internet for Social Machines, which is in fact a more popular way of saying an Internet of Fair Data and Services, where the data sets can be found by machines, where the workflows, the virtual machines, the Docker images, for those who were there this morning, know where to go, where to find the data, and so on. That's a completely new way of doing science. So open science has very little to do with open. Fair is not the same as open. It's accessible under well-defined conditions. So this is our cartoon, very much inspired on the hourglass, with now 3 sides. What is the Internet of Fair Data and Services? The data are somewhere. Is that me?
I think so.
My phone is off.
Do you have your email open maybe?
You know what? I will certainly switch my Wi-Fi off. That's better, because it's Jerome here, of course. Okay, so the Internet of Fair Data and Services. The data are somewhere on the web, in a repository. The tools are traveling the web, and the computer is somewhere. Of course, when you do a job as a workflow, you have to have sufficient compute, the data, and your workflow at the same place. In the middle, there is very much something like the TCP/IP, but now digital objects that are rooted, and the same people that developed TCP/IP are now working in GoFair, in C2 Camp, on how to deal with digital objects and routing them in the web. Now, what happens here is very important to understand. The data on the top there are usually, and in many cases, too big or too private, or both, to move. You try to move a petabyte of data around on the web, you better have very thick cables. While the workflows are tiny, they can travel by 4G. So what you will see happening is distributed learning over data that stay where they are. That's the trend. And in my hospital, we are not even able to give the data to anyone else. So I always say, stop sharing data. And people say, what? Stop sharing data? Well, let them be visited. That's different, because if you say data sharing, people think, oh, I send my data to you, I lose control, you can do whatever you want, I'm against that. But if you keep control of your own data and you let workflows visit them, and you decide what you allow and under which conditions you give them the results, that's a very different situation. So this is really the basic modus operandi. Of course, there will still be big weather modeling things that needs to be done on a big computer, but give you one example that we are now establishing in the Netherlands. We do very heavy computation on proteins. And we do that entirely on a company called Nerdalize. And what they developed is a water heater, boiler in the bathroom of people that is an HPC computer. You plug it into the high-speed internet and into the current. And I do my calculations on your shower, and I heat your water. And I pay half of the price of their heating. And if they made a calculation that if they put these things in 800,000 houses in the Netherlands, they're bigger than the Google Cloud. So also the compute will be distributed more and more. So that's where we go. So I always tease people that want to build big towers, and of course this is not true, but to say the supercomputer of the future works on DNA and is basically 8 billion smartphones. Okay, that's the most powerful computer we have at the moment. But also we have to be much more clever about data. So this is the only example I will give from my own research, and then we will go back to the Internet of Fair Data and Services. So this is what we now also do for metadata, by the way, but it is for later. Basically, every association that we see in science, whether this is social sciences or in the hard sciences, Doesn't matter. This king was king of this country for this particular period of time. What is the concept of God in theology is very different when you draw it from the Vedic literature, the Christian literature, the Muslim literature. So you can see semantic drift of concepts and all these things. So this is not only for hard sciences, but I will give you an example of my own field. So as I told you, I worked on malaria before. Now you have the tiniest statement, we call them nanopublications, which is the smallest scientific statement that makes sense. For example, subject, predicate, object, that's where the SP and O stands for. Malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. And you know it cannot be the other way. Mosquitoes are not transmitted by malaria, sometimes it can. That statement is one nanopublication that you need to know who said it, when, where. Okay? Now, as a good biologist, I call everything a ohm, genome, proteome, and so on. Now we invented this term, the explicitome, that is everything we already made explicit in the literature and in databases in the life sciences. And our estimate is that so far we have done 10 to the 14th of these statements, roughly. Could be 10 to the 15th, but 10 to the 14th. There's no computer that can run over that. However, take the example of malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. That same three numbers, because if you have everything machine readable, this is 3 UUIDs or 3 PIDs. The computer will recognize in Medline alone, the big database, you will find that exact same statement 8,000 plus times. Every time the provenance is different, because somebody else said it in a different DOI, in a different article and so on, but still it's the same assertion. So now we can already reduce, on average, the number of assertions 1,000 times. So now we are down to 10 to the 11th, which is already manageable by a very expensive Cray machine. Because if we collapse this cardinal assertion, as we call it, and we store the provenance that we know it was done 8,000 times in Medline alone, and we can always go there if we want to, we can still reason over this assertion. Now, if you take the next step and you take the cardinal assertions that all start with the concept malaria, in this case the subject is malaria, the green ball, then we create what we call a knowledge, which is everything we ever said about malaria. And then we have everything we ever said about a gene, or a protein, or a drug, or whatever, a person, or a data set, by the way. These knowledge are tiny little files, and we only have, don't laugh, we only have 1 million of them. So we only publish about 1 million genes, diseases, and drugs in the whole Medline area. And they fit on this laptop. So by reducing the data, without losing any trail, to these knowledge, and they move in a dynamic way, you get this kind of things. This is from our research. People say, okay, these obese people in the United States that have diabetes type 2 and metabolic syndrome, they seem to be more prone to develop early onset Alzheimer. So now the computer is able, after we integrated 200 databases like this, to say, okay, these are the knowledge of the 3 diseases. You see metabolic syndrome and obesitas have a very big overlap, and diabetes type 2. Then you have early onset Alzheimer, and the computer tells you immediately there's only 5 genes and metabolites that are common to these 3 knowledge. And they make total sense to the people that work on this. Then we got metabolomic data, and they say, hey, there is also 4 metabolites that seem to be consistently associated with people that get early onset Alzheimer, and they're all regulated by those genes. Boom. This would take you, if you look at the little red number, 3,236 papers you would have to read to get this in your head, but of course you would never be able to get it. So that's what the computer does for us in 2 seconds, okay? So if we have these knowledge, we can have a dynagraph, not a static knowledge graph, of all these things moving, and they move. You can deal with near sameness, like a mouse gene and a human gene are virtually identical, but they are still different. So if you zoom in enough, you see that they are separate concepts, but if you zoom out, they act as one concept. You also see semantic drift, how a concept moves over time. And we have already movies where you see a gene and a disease moving closer and closer over time until even people got it, and they publish a paper. But the computer would have predicted this years before in many cases. So we should stop reading. We only do confirmational reading at the end. We should stop with static knowledge graphs because they cannot handle the knowledge. They are just ontologies and they tell you very nicely what we know, but it's not where we do discovery. We do discovery as we call in the liquid phase, not in the gas phase, in the liquid phase, where we have concepts that are moving and then we finally get close to artificial intelligence, which doesn't exist yet. It's just a hype term for machine learning in my view, but that's another story that we don't discuss today. If we want to get this right, we have to treat every bit sequence in the internet, dataset, nanopublication, knowledge, workflow as a digital object, okay? And every digital object, this is from a paper we are producing at the moment, Larry Lanham and Peter Wittenberg and George Strawn, the same guy. It will have a persistent identifier and it will have metadata and access methods. So the machine knows what it can do with the digital object, whether it's a workflow or a dataset. And now the entire Internet of Fair Data and Services, in fact, a collection of those digital, atomic digital objects. And of course, this could be a whole database, like Uniprot, could be a single nanopublication, could be a workflow, a digital object could be any bit stream in the Internet. But the machine should know what it can do with it, what it is, under which conditions, and that's what FAIR is all about. So, this is from a presentation that will be given in January, it's slide number 31, as you can see, by the Boston Consulting Group to the World Economic Forum on FAIR and the personal health train. And what I highlighted there is one of the most abused things about FAIR. It's not just for people. If just people can find you and access you and so on, it's not enough. Machines, I would even have swapped this around for computers and then also people. Because if things are well defined for machines, like malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and I have the unique identifier for the disease malaria, and I know that somebody is from France, I can show paludisme in the interface, you know, because the ontology knows that's the same concept. So if you publish your stuff machine readable, you force yourself, A, to be much more precise. No fancy language and poetry. That's not what we need in science. You want to communicate what you really want to say. And if you cannot fit it in a triple, throw it away, because it's just storytelling. So even in social sciences, I think you want to, in fact, make some claim, and you may need a lot of rhetoric in the back to say why and so on. I will say later, if you have time, if I have time for my cartoons in the end, that we need to publish data with a supplementary paper and not the other way around, but we'll come back to that. And we only can do this the internet approach, where IP and TCP IP are in the middle. This is George Strawn, he's almost a saint for us now. And if you would want to put this to the Internet of Fair Data and Services, at the very center is a persistent, unique, resolvable identifier for every concept you refer to. So if people ask me, when am I fair? Well, summarize FAIR, the 14 principles and all the metrics and everything in the one-liner. Say, the machine knows what I mean. That's it. Make sure the machine knows what you mean. And all the principles are derived from that principle. And what is happening? This is again a paper from George Strawn and Peter Wittenberg, Common Patterns in Developing Infrastructures. And they compare electricity, the railways, the internet, World Wide Web, GSM, and it all follows this pattern according to them, and I agree. So you have a vision or some discovery of electricity or something. Then you get a phase that they call creolization, or cottage industry. Everyone has their solutions and they think it's the best solution ever. And at some point there is a tractor. 220 volts, TCP IP, GSM. People say, you know, this mess is not going to work. And then a large enough critical group comes together and says, we voluntarily choose for this approach, and the rest of the world follows, and then you get convergence, and then it explodes into real use. And you know, there were people when electricity was coming up saying, you think we will get rid of all these ladders and the people that light the gas lamps? No, never. So you will get all these people say, oh, my arrow will stop, help, help. Make sure it doesn't stop. But there is a point where suddenly there's no way back. Like all the standards for telephones. Remember the time you had to switch telephone when you went to the United States and so on. Basically, what they say in this paper is FAIR is the attractor. It's not yet a converger, but GoFair and EOSC could be the convergers. So we are now here, this was from the country meeting. What we believe is that by 2020, we will have based the Internet of Fair Data and Services on minimal standards, voluntary participation, critical mass, and rough consensus and running code. Any top-down initiative is doomed to fail. How fast will this go? My prediction for 2019 is we are working very hard on a data stewardship wizard that makes it extremely easy for funders to require FAIR and for the PIs to actually comply with FAIR. And industry is moving in big time. Accenture, Mobiquity, Elsevier, Fixshare, they're all in GoFair to set the standards. And when that happened in the internet as we know it in the 90s, and I'm having actually a talk to George on Saturday how fast it went, very soon after that NSF pulled back. Industry took over. So my prediction is that somewhere early 2020-21, the Commission and everyone will pull out. And the only thing we have to do is safeguard the interests of the public sector so that we do not create 5 more Elseviers, you know? That is what we have to watch for. We don't have to build this. This is happening with Amazon, with the 5 big ones, and so on. Now, how difficult is FAIR? First of all, of course, there is one downside of the acronym. It has an ethical connotation, FAIR. Okay? So people say, oh, so is my data unfair? If it's no, we said it's just reuseless. Okay? So nobody will reuse your data, but that's at least not an ethical term. It's just reuseless. This is 90%, because we are nice here, but it's in fact 90% of the data do not even have a PID as a data set. They are behind some weird link in some paper as supplementary data, and 30% of them rot away every year. So we make the life a nightmare for machines, okay? They cannot even, there's not even a PID so that I can cite the data. Because we focus on stupid papers. And that's how we judge our people, journal impact factor. That's the most horrible thing, I'll come back to that. So the very, very first thing we have to do is to give data, every digital object, including datasets, but we now focus on data, a PID, a persistent identifier, a DOI, whatever. Then, even if the data cannot be fair, we were discussing videos or whatever, that's fine, but you still have fair annotations and metadata that are machine readable, say this is video, so if you want to really, but it is about this and this and this and this. And we have user-defined metadata and intrinsic metadata. It's a little bit too much to go into that, but you have the metadata that are there when the data set is created, and then people will start reusing the data and say, don't use this data with this workflow, doesn't work. That's part of the user-defined metadata, so that the next machine doesn't make the same mistake to crash because there is a mistake in column 4 of a certain data set. So we will keep annotating data in a machine-readable way. Then, and this is a very important point, the data themselves, that's the red thing, could be closed. Fair is not the same as open, okay? So it means accessible under well-defined conditions. So the metadata could say to the machine, if you really want to use these patient data here in the Leiden University Medical Center, my own institution, you better call this doctor, or unless you have a white coat and a beeper and your personnel number, otherwise you cannot use the data. They're still fair. They're not accessible for open. Then, of course, ideally, data should be open and machine readable themselves, not only the metadata. So that's the next step. And now what is the good news, and people have been at Science Europe before, I mean, people say the default is, the funders, the European Commission as a first, you take my public funding, the default of your data that you created by taxpayer money is open. Unless you have a very good story, like patient security and so on. So people that think that as scientists, and I'm a scientist myself for my whole life, I've never understood people say, this is my data. Well, you're paid for your hobby, first of all, by taxpayers' money. Otherwise, get a real job. Now, and secondly, I create data paid for by taxpayers. They're not mine, they're public good. Unless I have a very good story. So people that create data without a good data stewardship plan should be in jail, at least in intellectual jail, okay? But there could be reasons to say they're not fair. They're not open, but still fair. Even the pharma is making their data fair now. They spend a lot of money on making their data fair. They're not open, but now they talk to public data. Hey, that's interesting. So ideally, we have an internet of fair data and services where even the links are there, so all data are connected. But we are not there yet, but that's the final goal. So the old situation, and this is even discussed with Google, people make an app or an application or let's say a smartphone app, and they had to keep their own big data warehouse, you know? So they have to do continuous extract, transform, load from all the source databases. Central updating, they have a lot of GDPR issues, enormous costs, and it's a black box. The new situation is now that apps are created, they're virtual machines, they go around in the Internet of Fair Data and Services, and they find all the stuff that is needed without cumbersome ETL, centralized updating, and so on. And you can also get rid of the GDPR issues because I can decide on my smartphone who can see my data and for what. So, not only humans can now start an idea, but also machines. So we have several companies already that have these developing knowledge graphs, and there is this new correlation coming up between, as I give an example, COPD and thyroid gland. I explained this morning, or anything, and say, what's the thing? The machine goes around, the virtual machine, we call them trains. They go to all the fair data stations and they come up with a documented answer why they think there is a connection between COPD and thyroid gland, while every doctor so far says, Medline, no correlation in Medline. But the computer knows there is 5 proteins that are regulated by the thyroid gland and that are biomarkers for COPD, and in 196,000 patients, they go down after their thyroid gland is removed and you cause COPD. So the correlation is there. Doctors know less than 1% of what the explicitome knows, which we call the implicitome. So even this is then again presented for the World Economic Forum. The Fair Data Station is essentially a fair data point with enough metadata for the machine to know what it can do. The health train, or the farm train, we have the farm train, this is not restricted to health, comes to the Fair Data Station, says, can I ask this question? And the tracks obviously are the minimal standards that you need to adhere to. If your wheels are too wide, your train doesn't fit on the track. That's all we have to do. That's the TCP/IP level. So, get out of your comfort zone as a traditional researcher or librarian or whatever, and there's a number of things that are going on. First of all, when we talk open science, don't think all the workflows and the data will be open. They are fair, which means accessible under well-defined conditions. You decide. The findability, accessibility, and interoperability are just means to an end. The final role that we want for workflows in any digital object in the Internet of Fair Data and Services is that they are reused. Now, if they are reuseless, they cannot even be reused. But if you don't adorn them with rich metadata, the chance that your research objects, your digital objects that are research objects, will be reused is smaller. And the totally perverse award system for scientists now on journals should change to digital objects. Now, a digital object could be an article. It's 1/1000th of research output. But I want to be cited on my data sets. We have a Nature paper with the Japanese with 16 million nanopublications on transcription start sites in the genome, and they can all be individually cited. Of course, every time any of those nanopublications is cited, data, the paper gets a citation as well. So they get only more citations on the paper, but the paper is just a tiny little blurb of text. You cannot describe 94,000 transcription start sites and their position in mouse and man in a bloody paper. That's just an old-fashioned way to communicate science. So you need to publish the data and you have a supplementary paper. Don't try to make systems interoperable. make sure they can deal with fair data. So don't try to make the systems interoperable. Stop data sharing. Make your data visitable. And forget data warehousing. Don't spoil time to bring all the data together because it's a nightmare to update. You have to do ETL. Make sure you do distributed learning over sessile data. Of course, there are examples where this is impossible. But as I said this morning and yesterday at dinner, I have a good bottle of Carmenere, good wine from Chile, for the first one that comes to me with a question that not for performance reasons, but principally cannot be answered by distributed learning. And I still have the bottle after a year and a half. So that's, but if anyone comes up here later and convinces me there is a question that cannot principally be answered by distributed learning over data that are distributed, then you have a nice bottle of wine. So, GoFair is trying to do this. This is a thing we presented at the second EOSC summit. So we started with 3 countries, but we are getting more countries on board now. We work with implementation networks that know what they're doing and build a component of the Internet of Fair Data and Services, and preferably have critical mass. We have Go Change, Go Train, Go Build. We believe that we have to train 500,000 data stewards. 1 in 20 researchers should be a professional data steward that knows what he or she is talking about. I, as a biologist, have no clue about data. Does anyone know what it costs to store a petabyte of data per year? 180,000 euros. You buy any cryo-EM microscope today, that's what it produces every year. Do you budget for it? No. I want the machine. In jail. You're wasting my taxpayers' money. You know, you don't even have a data stewardship plan. We'll come back to that. If we have time. How am I doing on time? I have no idea, actually. Yeah? Okay. So FAIR, we had the original paper, and I made all the authors green that are now in GoFair. So the FAIR principles, people can say whatever they want about them. We just published them. And I'm the last author there, so I'm the corresponding author. I know that it has been cited almost 900 times already, and everybody talks about FAIR, but they all have their own interpretation. And then we have the FAIR metrics now that is also written by a subset of those authors. So we believe that at least we can claim that the implementation choices we made under the FAIR principles are the ones that are in line with what the original authors of the article meant. That doesn't mean it's the only right thing to do, but that's what we have made as an implementation choice. And if you want to join GoFair as an implementation network or whatever, and we have already up to 30, you agree with those choices, which are very minimal. Follow the FAIR principles, the way we measure them, and you sign in blood against vendor lock-in, because that would kill the internet. So that's the only thing you want to have to do to join GoFair. Now, of course, as we said, there is people say, oh, we need to add more letters to FAIR, ethical this. No, you know, go ahead. If you want to do that, that's your way of FAIR. They think it's a standard. They think it's enough for humans. And we even wrote a paper, Clouding Increasingly Fair, which is never cited because people don't read it. They read the article, the original article, they make their own interpretation, and they do all kinds of stuff. And we decided not to bother about that anymore. And I think in this area I can say it, we even claimed the URL Go Fair yourself. Which means, you know, if you want to do it in another way, that's fine. But we don't think it will lead to the Internet of Fair Data and Services. However, there's also all kinds of initiatives like EOSC Live, the astronomy people, AGU, the American Geophysical Union. They got, I even have the sticker here, they get money from the Arnold Foundation to make their data fair. Why would they? I mean, they're aiming at the same thing, to get the Internet of Fair Data and Services. We are perfectly fine, we work with them. And I even told Shelley Stoll, who runs the AGU project, don't join GoFair. Be our poster child to show that you don't have to join GoFair. It's not a goal as such. I want to stop GoFair in 2 years from now because we have the Internet of Fair Data and Services. It's not something that should stay. It's a Kickstarter. That's how we presented it also. Now, how is this all going to be financed? the data stewardship cycle is really complex. I wrote a book and it's about it, and it contains 115 questions a good data steward should answer in all these phases. So don't think as stupid biologists like we would ever learn that. These are professionals, and they're not data scientists that make a new algorithm for everything I ask. No, they implement what is there, and they know where the repositories are, and they know what services are out there, and so on. And we have said in our report, 5% of every research grant on average should go to that. So we say, don't fund any research anymore, and I think most funders are now compliant, without a good data stewardship plan. And they are eligible costs. We expect that on average, this will be about 5% of the research grant. All funders in Europe together spend about 200 billion a year. So that creates right there a market for data stewardship services of 10 billion annually. And Elsevier made a calculation for the whole world, including the private sector, and they come to 100 billion, which makes sense. So the data stewardship market for fair data is now 100 billion a year. That's even a lot of money for the Googles and for the Elseviers, you know. That's why they all move in. There's more fair activity in the industry than in the public sector already. Only 15% of scientists know what fair is in the first place, according to a recent survey by Figshare. And they thought it was a few. I said, well, that's already good. A few years ago, it didn't exist. Now, already 15% know how to do it. So, how can we do this in practice for the funding? Because how are you going to pay all this? Well, 5%. Yeah, but you steal 5% of my grant for data stewardship. Oh, did you ever call your research fund and say, you steal 5% of my grant for chemicals? No. So this is part and parcel of good research practice. And if you create data and you spit data out there without a data stewardship plan, you're wasting my taxpayers' money. You should be in jail. In intellectual jail, let's keep that. So we think the PI makes a data stewardship plan that is checked by a certified data steward as soon as we have them, but we have also tools to check them for you. Then when it is submitted to the funder, basically it's like your ethical paragraph. I work with humans and mice, but it's okay, my local committee looked at it. The funder should literally take it for granted and say, okay, this is a good data stewardship plan, it's well budgeted, they create a petabyte of data, but they clearly budgeted 180,000 euros to store those for 5 years. Top. Well done. Then you get your grant. And now the trick comes. What we want to do is that the funders increasingly say, that's fine, here's 5%, but you can only reclaim those costs, you only get your last 10% anyway at the final report, if you spend that with certified providers. Certified repositories, certified analytics tools that give you sufficient provenance to know what you have been done. They're not black boxes and so on and so on. And then you can get your money. And then the Figshares and the Elseviers, the Mendeleys, and everyone will run to get certified. So that is the only way to get a bottom-up fair Internet of Fair Data and Services, not some top-down, you know, centralized thing that will never work. So now I can stop. But I can also show you the 7 capital sins of open science, which is another 5 minutes. And then it's up to you. So either we stop now and have questions, or I show you 7 cartoons, which is very fast, which is the 7 capital sins we all do when we do open science. Is there still time for that? Okay. So this is your typical silverback gorilla, and he's in this case sitting on top of the rock, of course, and reading 7 ways to prevent change, which is the 7 sins of open science. So the first one is, I will judge my students by journal impact factor, age factor, I always mispronounce that correctly, you know, whether they publish in Cell, Nature, Science, the whole stupid PLANS discussion at the moment. That should be completely over and killed. Kick these guys out. And ladies as well. And now, as Max Planck already said, science progresses one funeral at a time. So if these young people are not awarded by sharing their data and working with online workflows and so, it will never work. Sin number 1. Sin number 2 if you get anyone in your research group that does this, you should kill them or get them out, because they ignore complexity. Pharma has done this for years. That's why the pharma is in crisis. Biology is so much more complex than you can discover from reading databases, that if you stick your head in the sand and still keep reading articles and databases ahead of time, so of course you read confirmational reading at the end, but let the computer create your hypothesis based on data. Because think back of my example of the 3 knowledge of obesity and so on. If you try to find that by reading, you will be gone in 3 years and you still didn't find it. The computer can find it in 5 seconds. So publish your data in machine-readable format. Learn to respect other disciplines. Because on the right-hand side, you see a biologist. Left-hand side, with the ponytail, of course, you see the ICT guy. There's the E-infrastructures versus the domains, the S3s, whatever. And they don't even understand each other. If I say federate the gems, I mean what I just explained. You know what the E-infra people here take all the links in Europe, put them under a portal, and now we have the EOSC. We don't even understand each other, you know? So then, of course, this 4th sin is, and this is for a scientist, if you work with big data, you see an endless number of patterns in the big data, the machine. And you can publish all kinds of spurious correlations. This beautiful correlation between the chocolate consumption per country and the number of Nobel Prize winners. Yes! So publish your data with a supplementary paper to explain to people why you came to this conclusion. So I'm not against narrative, but it's not the leading communication of science. Now, this is the worst. And this is where even, you know, open access doesn't help. The train there, it says fair railways, and you see EOSC in the smoke, is trying to, this is a machine, a virtual machine, trying to find data. Imagine today's nightmare. Even if the article is open access, oh boy, you don't pass under the bridge because you have to do text mining, and then you get a paywall for those that are not open access. Then you get into the text, and the real interesting stuff is in tables and figures and TIFF files that you cannot even mine. So if you have not committed suicide by then as a computer, you may find a link to supplementary data. 30% disappears every year, and you don't know what the link means. And then maybe, if you're lucky, the data was not on the memory stick of the PhD student, but in a real repository, and you can still find it. And then you can start working. 80% of the time of the average PhD student goes up, several studies, in data munging before they can start their analysis because of this. So we communicate science in a completely old-fashioned way that should change tomorrow. Then the funders. Everybody wants to fund rocket science that leads to Nature papers. Nobody wants to fund the rocket launcher. What's the rocket launcher? The infrastructure. So here you see all the professors with their rockets, and there was no money for the rocket launcher. What's the point of rockets? Okay? So fund adequate infrastructure. Via the 5%, whatever, I don't care. Don't only focus on, yeah, we fund research. No, fund research infrastructure, otherwise you're wasting my taxpayers' money. And the last one, as I've said many times, one of the things I hate most is data is the new oil. That's terrible. Oil, we pump oil and oil and oil. We just make the environmental disaster worse, and all the birds and the fish die. We don't have pipelines. It's not renewable. Data is like love. It multiplies when shared. Okay? So information is very much more like love than it is like any oil, because if I share my knowledge with you, we both have it. We don't lose anything, we don't pollute anything. So unless we stop with those 7 capital sins, we will never get there. And if you want to learn how to avoid them or confess your sins, you're welcome in our office. Thank you.
We're gonna save questions until the end, I believe.
Okay, fine.
But
Oh,
thank you.
it was
It was
pleasure.
very interesting, and we have a little gift for you.
Oh, that's very typical. Well, I have to sit in the back and under
Yeah.
this thing.
Well, it's kind
Okay.
of cold in here, so you can sort of wrap yourself up.
Thank you so much.
So now we're going to hear from two of our own researchers and their experience with FAIR. First up is Alexander Refsum-Jensenius. He is an associate professor at the Department of Musicology here at the university, and he is also the deputy director of the RITMO Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Rhythm, Time, and Motion. And he's going to talk about how he, to the best of his ability, makes his own data and research fair. So please, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. At least to try to make it open, hopefully also fair. Thank you very much to the previous presenter. That was fantastic, and really, I'm going to try I'm of course going to have more of a kind of practical talk about how I work in my own research. I could also mention that I'm the there is I think there are the two screens here. Let's see. It's not accessible. I even have an open presentation. I think it might be there. Yeah, there we go. It's a Google presentation, so it is actually open with a commercial supplier. There we go. So I could also point out that I'm also now the Norwegian representative in the EUA Open Science Committee, so I'm involved in also policy making in Brussels. But today I'm going to talk about my own research, and I'm a music researcher. I work from a kind of an embodied perspective, so I try to understand what music is in the body of people making music, but also in the bodies of people experience music, like dancing, as you see here. And I try to do this both openly and fair. And I'll try to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm coming from the humanities, the arts and humanities, but I work empirically, which on its own, it's a bit strange, I guess. I work in a motion capture lab, where we try to figure out what's happening in our bodies. So many of our studies, they work like this, where we start out by taking people into the lab, we play some music to them of some kind, and then we capture their motion with different types of cameras. We also have normal video recordings, and we also have qualitative data. So it's a fair amount of mix of both quantitative and qualitative type of data. We are, more specifically, I'm working right now on a project on human standstill, organized the Norwegian Championship of Standstill. If you're interested in participating in this, you can join us in the next one in March. And the idea here is really to understand how music influences us when we're not trying to move. Now, as you know, this is a typical sketch of a normal research situation, and as it is today, of course, this part is expensive. This part is a black box. We don't really know what's going on there. Now, I've spent the last few weeks, as some of you know, talking about Plan S and the openness there, which will hopefully solve that part. But of course, then this thing is what we're trying to solve now. Now, my take on this is really to try to figure out how we can work with kind of opening up the entire research process. Starting really from the beginning. And I really think also that we should think of the application when you apply for funding for a research project. We should start to think that we actually begin our research even at that stage. So for the current project that I'm running, I started doing research already at the application stage to really try to verify some of the thoughts I had and doing some research. Grabbing some data from Plotly, which is a service for sharing data, and using that. And also using some sounds from a free sound database, which is also an open, accessible database that you can get some data from. Then coming out of some of the things that I worked on then for even at the application stage, but also later in my research, I share some sounds on services like SoundCloud. Also some of our motion capture stuff, we have a small database here at the University of Oslo, which is also in connection to Repovis, which is a kind of European level database where we also try to output some of our data resources. Now, part of the research process after you get funding and then now as we're working, I also think it's very important to share the source code of the software that we are developing and kind of the methodological parts of it. So we may grab some code from, for example, SourceForge, and we output our own code on GitHub. So that's also shareable and available for others. Also in terms of hardware solutions, I also work on hardware, building different types of instruments that we perform with, etc. So we also try to think of how can we also make open hardware solutions where you describe, for example, the electronics, and which this case was a result of a master project, which is actually also being sold, even though it's also open hardware. So anybody can download this. We perform as well. That's also part of our research. We perform with mobile orchestra, muscle band, and these things. And that also the outcomes of this is shared on YouTube and other services. So that's also kind of an output of this. When it comes to kind of moving ahead in the process here and moving to kind of towards the publishing side, we of course use a lot of resources. In this case, from Google Books here, but you also try to output it in open ways. And in my field, we are so lucky that we actually have a quite good open access journal. That's not the case in all fields. That particular journal, Empirical Musicology Review, is also has open peer review, so that the peer reviews are actually made available with the papers, which is also an interesting kind of concept. I also think it's, as a researcher, I totally agree with Barend here that I mean, publications, and normal publications, is just one of the outputs that we have of research. I mean, also blogging, for example, I think is a very important thing where you can really share things with the world. Of course, using Wikipedia is also an extremely important part of your research activities. LeanPub is an interesting thing. I'm writing a book now on LeanPub where I actually published the book when I started writing it. So it's available. Whenever I do an update, it will update the PDFs, EPUBs, etc. So it's kind of a lean publishing process. It's not entirely suited for academic work, though. So it would be very interesting to kind of develop these things further, but still an interesting project. And also, of course, we are exploring how we can also work with open educational resources. So I made a MOOC, Music Moves, which will start again on 21st of January, if you're interested to learn more about my stuff. It's openly available, again, as a way of thinking about the complete picture here. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that working with these things, we need to work with whatever is out there. Now we'll see if there are some more resources coming that we can build on, but again, there are already a lot of things out there, and we can try to cover some of these things. I'll mention one of the things that I really think is important to make this work is to have version control, commenting, and citations, of course, in addition to the IDs that was talked about earlier. But this is really important to also for kind of acknowledging the contributions that we have in the field and also for promoting more of this activity. Now, I'll just like to mention this because it's one of the reasons I think I mean, it's from you can say that it's an ideological kind of thing to share things, but also that you can actually see results coming out of it. And I have a story of some open source material that I made available in 2005 or 2006. I developed this video analysis method. It's used for analyzing dance movements in the lab, and I shared it openly. It's been online since 2005, and it's been taken up and been used in a lot of different types of music analysis research. It's also used in music performances. But the interesting thing was that I was on TV and explaining this, and then this guy called from Trondheim and said, "Oh, do you want to try these things on my babies?" So he's working with children, preterm or early born infants, and said, "Do you want to test this software on them?" And I said, "Yes, let's try it." And in fact, it turned out that the analysis method that I had originally developed for looking at dancers, looking at the rhythmicity of these dancers, can also be used to look at these infants and to be able to actually detect whether these infants are in risk zone of developing cerebral palsy or not. So this has been developed into kind of a complete package now that is under clinical testing around the world, and it's really a good example of how basic research in the arts can lead to kind of clinical innovation. Now, if I have 2 more minutes, I'll just share one more thing. Again, trying to look at the entire picture of open science. We're really trying to kind of combine this into one package now. So we have a new concept that we have developed together with the science library here, which is called Music Lab. And here the idea is really to try to have an evening activity where it's built around a performance. So we have a panel session in the beginning where we talk about a particular topic, and then we have a performance of music or dance and other things. And we actually use that also as kind of a test case for recording also the audience reactions and also what's going on with the performers. So in this case, we were having breath sensors on the performers. We had then what we call data jockeying, DJing, towards the end, where we kind of had live analysis of these things in the club with beer and everything else. So again, trying to make this open and hopefully also fair, so that also the data can be available also in a social and educational setting. So that's kind of summarizing how I'm thinking about the future of open science, really trying to see how all of it can fit together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Next up, and our final speaker is Kirsti Klette. She is a professor at the Department of Teacher Education and School Research. In addition, she is also the Center Director of the Nordic Center of Excellence in Education. And the title of her talk is taken from a principle that is very central in open science, namely as open as possible, as closed as necessary. So please, Kirsti.
So thank you. And hopefully, Barend, neither Alexander nor I will be put in your intellectual jail. But maybe we are not totally in your sort of idea of vision right yet. At least not my data. So I'm sorry. Do you have to start it over again? Okay. So again, thank you for this opportunity. And hopefully, neither Alexander nor I will be put in your intellectual jail. However, at least my area would be not totally open, but hopefully moving towards being fair. So I will talk from the educational sciences. My background is, as the introductor stated, in education and teaching and school research. And we are using a lot of video data in order to understand teaching and learning processes. So we have videos from the teachers, from the students. We have hundreds of videos from classrooms all around Norway. And it's extremely expensive data to collect. So we try to use them as reusable as possible. However, as Barend said, you have to plan for this very carefully. And I'll share with you some of the principles how we try to solve this problem at this point. To some degree, I would also argue that, videos and video capturings have made a sort of revolution in our area, in the sense that actually we could record and teachers and students in one package from the classroom, bring it back to campus, and sit here and freeze and analyze and do in-depth analysis of the way teachers pose questions, how we give feedback, how the students are engaged, etc., etc. So it's like a sort of microscope for our area, I would argue. It also has some challenges because, as you know, videos are not by default sensitive, but they are personal. So people are not anonymous. So we need to have a system for paying attention to ethics when it comes to privacy and anonymization. And also, I would argue that videos are extremely powerful representation of key practices in education, but also in, I would guess, medicine, psychology, odontology. So it could be a very powerful tool to use outside the original research agenda, but as a way of presenting key practices in the different areas. So, for example, we use it for teacher training. We use these videos for teachers' professional development. We use them for video exams when in our teacher training programs, etc. But as I said, they are extremely expensive and time and resource demanding data. And that's another argument for actually making as strong use of them as possible. This means there is a lot of challenges, as I said, linked to ethical regulations, and also the quality of the videos to make them reusable by the quality of the audio and the video, and also storage solutions and how to have virtual solutions to access them. And maybe at this point, maybe the most important, to have some systems for metadata solutions. Otherwise, you can just drop the whole FAIR principle. So my argument would be that you, as a researcher, you need to have procedures and plan for the whole workflow from the beginning. And we need that as a researcher, but also we need to train our students and our PhD students in this sort of thinking. So when going and planning for the whole workflow, a key issue is for our data notification forms, both in terms of how you sort of present your data for the national authorities, and especially in terms of consent forms. And you know, there will not be any sort of reusability and interoperability if you don't have the consent to use the data in this sense. So you have to plan carefully, long time ahead. For example, we are using the data for research, but we're not only using it for research here at the university, but also in this Nordic News Center, but also together with colleagues in the US, in Europe, in Australia. So I have to put that into the consent forms. And also we want to use this data for teacher training. So I asked for them to have consent to use this data to have my lectures or our lectures at the university. And also we use it for example, professional training of teachers or therapists or whatever. So, and you have to have that consent form in from the beginning, otherwise it's a nightmare. So you have to really think carefully for the whole workflow. But also this goes for data collection, the quality of the videos. And actually, right now the technology is on our side, so the videos are wonderful, but audio is the problem. To really have good capturings for audio that, for example, capture a lot of voices and utterances. And also standards for file names and ways of tagging the data. Because, you know, you have to bring them back to the lab or the university or the virtual lab. And then it has to be very clear and informative systems how you tagged your data. So again, there will not be any sort of findable or accessible if you don't have meta tagging standards. And I think that's maybe the main challenge right now. But also in terms of storage solutions. And as it is now, we are at the University of Oslo, and we have this wonderful service linked to the sensitive data, which is wonderful. But the problem is it's too wonderful to some degree, because it's too safe. If you are behind that wall, you will not access the data afterwards. So we need a solution that's in the sort of middle ground here. And that's why, for example, we are now discussing this sort of TSD Lite version. For example, our data isn't that sensitive, you know. So they don't need to be behind that wall. And also how to analyze the data and reuse the data in different ways. For example, I just got a mail from one of the master students from a colleague at Humanities. She was interested in, do you have any videos from group work in language arts lessons, and where there are sort of a certain rhythm of who is talking when? And then I said, okay, let's go back. And then, yes, we look at all this data tagged group work, and then we have a tagging system on discourses. And then she could access all the classrooms with those two together. So it's a way of sort of accessing the data and making them shareable. But, you know, I can do that because I asked for that in the consent form. Hadn't I done that, I couldn't do that. However, I plan to play a video today for you, but I didn't ask in the consent forms if I could share the videos openly. I just asked for using it very sort of targetedly for educational purposes, so I couldn't share that video today. But also you need to think about this when presenting the data. So, for example, as you might know from classrooms, there might be students not willing to participate. We call those red students. And then we need to have systems. So we are not sort of showing videos where they are in, for example. And also we need to have a system for actually when people would like to withdraw from this database. So again, you need to pay carefully in advance how we will use, analyze, share, and represent these data. And that also, for example, people are suggesting this sort of dynamic consent as a way of accessing the informants afterwards, but then you're actually collecting a lot of information about them you don't really need. So it's sort of balance here, because you might need to go back to them. You ask them for a lot of personal information, but actually you might not need it. So my argument would be, we are moving forward here. We are towards something like shareable by design, and the main thing is to plan for the whole workflow, and this is extremely important in our training of researchers and PhD students, for example. As it is now, it's too much into my head, and it should be built into the system. I think the main problem as it is now is standards for meta tagging. And I think people are really sort of discussing here, and a lot of people say that this need to be on a project level. I think there are a lot of generic solutions here to look for. I think it need to be beyond the single project. And also in terms of like our data, for example, consent form requirements. And we have also a double problem, because we need to have parents consent because they are under 16 years old. So as it is now, it seems like there are sort of national specific interpretations of these GDPR requirements here. So maybe it would be possible to have shared standards. For example, I have colleagues in Munich who put all those who are not willing to participate in being videotaped having a yellow T-shirt on. That would not at all be possible in our system. And again, the issue of the problem of data minimization versus some of the FAIR principles that actually push us to collect more data than we really need. Thank you.
So we are going to open up for a little bit of a Q&A session now. So I would like to invite all speakers back on stage. Ooh. Well, sorry. Is that okay?
It's okay, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, that's
So are there any questions?
no? Okay.
Because otherwise I have a question to Barend. In your talk, you said that when scientists apply for grants, they should include in their funding plan that they should have 5% to cover basically making data fair and all of things like that. But what about those researchers who don't normally rely on grant funding, who they have tenure and they sit and work by themselves, they're not part of a big team? How should they go about making their data fair?
Yeah. Is this still working?
Yes, but
Yeah?
if you put a little closer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me first nuance that I didn't say everyone should ask for 5%. We said people that do research, regardless of where they try to get the money from, especially if they use public funding, should have a proper data stewardship plan. Okay, this could be 1% of their grant, or 20, or in the case of the cryo-EM, 50. But we think that on average that would pan out to 5%. That's how we come to this conclusion. So I think that also, even in industry, people should think about the data they create and what to do with them, what they want to use them for, and as you just showed, get enough metadata to make them fair. And I think there is an extra responsibility if you accept public funding to be paid for your hobby and you create data. They're not yours. They are a common good. And I believe that even people that don't rely on grants should do the same thing. So the basic principle is don't create data without a good data stewardship plan. And by coincidence, we think the average data stewardship plan will, on average, be 5%. Okay?
Yep.
So don't think we will request 5% for if you. Some research may not even create data as such. You know, you try to make a new machine, whatever, then you may need less than 1%. Yeah.
Yeah.
No questions? Oh.
Here it is.
Hello, good day. My Prashadis. I'm working in the neuroinformatics lab and with the new Human Brain Project. I have a question for Professor Mons about I would like to know what are your thoughts about data curation and metadata curation? Because we're in the same line at you, but we're facing this challenge of keeping the quality of all the things that we want to make fair.
Was that to me again? Okay. Well, data curation is one of these ambiguous terms. In my field, it means also curation like UniProt, that has 70 curators creating UniProt, okay? And that is extremely important. I love UniProt, we use it every day, but in a way it's ridiculous because 80% of the work of those 70 people is recovering from articles, will be buried in those articles first and try to find out what the heck of which protein did they mean, you know? So that's a waste of time, because if we would have published those data in correct format, they didn't have to do that brain dead work. What you probably mean by data curation is that you get your raw data and you do some steps to make them cleaner or, you know, prepare them for research, where you already, the moment you curate data, of course, you already impose a certain interpretation on your data. If I decide to throw away the images of my sequencing and only store the sequence of a DNA sequence, I make a choice already. So curation of data is very important, obviously, but as for everything we say, keep the exact provenance of what you did to the data, so that if people get strange results because they don't understand your curation process, they can trace back why that result was there. So provenance is the most important thing. If people, for example, challenge me on fair doesn't say anything about quality, yeah? You can make up completely bogus data and make them fair. And we deliberately didn't address that. Provenance is even more important than quality, because quality is in the eye of the beholder. If I do my analysis over real life data, I want to be able to say, what if I exclude self-reporting by smartwatches of patients? Hey, my pattern disappears. So at least I know the pattern that I'm meant to see was only based on patient self-reporting, and then I decide whether I want to believe that or not. So curation is a very dangerous area, because there is no curation without worldview that you impose on the data already. So provenance, record exactly, and again in machine readable format, what you did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I follow up? Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe.
No, you first.
Yeah. And I link to this because I really liked your sort of ambitious arguments about the this sort of stewardship plan and also curating. But I think in this sense, it's extremely important, as far as I have experienced, that you work really closely with the technical staff here. So often it's sort of two divided areas and worlds almost. So you have the technical support and engineers, and then you have the researchers. And to really make those systems usable for the researchers, they need to work very tightly together. So my question is that sort of built into your plans?
One of my cartoons was the two silos.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the first thing you need to do, if you want to do open science, you have to respect other disciplines. And there's even an official psychological problem, it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, look it up in Wikipedia. That is that you always overestimate your competence in an area you don't know anything about. You are not hindered by any knowledge. And you underestimate the complexity of the other domain. So of course, the infrastructure people say, oh yeah, we need a few ontologies, that's all the easy part. Yeah, sure. We think, oh, you just buy bigger machine and thicker cables. No, it's much more complex than that. So a very important part indeed of open science is that by definition, if you need to work with data scientists and engineers and nerds, you know, and we are nerds as well, respect them. And work with them, and if you think they don't understand what you mean, say it again and say it again and say it again until you're sure. Because even if you say model, a data scientist has a completely different concept about what a model is than I have as a biologist, let alone somebody in fashion. You know? So we have to really make sure that we talk about the same concepts. And this is probably the most important skill we are telling our modern biology students. Don't look away when somebody has a ponytail and 5 piercings and spends his whole day out behind the screen. Those are the people you have to work with, to put a caricature, of course. But you know, so that's really important, really important.
Alexander?
And to expand on the same thing, I guess, is here at the University of Oslo, we're having a lot of different types of working groups trying to figure out how we can move ahead in this thing. And then you're talking about the researcher versus the IT personnel, but also what I've seen is that I think there's a triangle between the IT people, the librarians, and also the research administration, kind of in working together also with the researchers. And what do you think about that in terms of getting these things together?
Well, again, it's the same story. In fact, you could have more silos. All these elements of highly complex science are extremely important. The management, the funding, and if people, I'm a scientist myself, but how arrogant can they be? You know, I'm so good, I know all this. I will start a company on Friday and be the CEO, destroy 5 companies. You know, they think they can do everything. So scientists should stick to what they're good at. That is designing the hypothesis, doing the research, respect the data steward that sit next to them and say, probably you should collect a bit more rich metadata to become fair and annotate your videos. Have respect for the people that manage the grants, research administrations, and don't treat librarians badly. Of course, librarians should also change. The librarian of the future is a data steward, not somebody who manages books. That's clear. But a lot of, when we said to the LUMC, you need to train 75 data stewards, that's about 5% of our people, 1,500 people create data. We have 800 PhD students, they spend 80% of their time data munging, so we can already pay for the data stewards, etc., etc. And of course the dean didn't want to do it until he found out that when we did a survey on the skills, that we had already 60 people in the library and in many places in the LUMC that with 2 weeks of course would be first level data steward. So librarians have to reinvent themselves as well, of course. And not stick to the old paradigm and say, as long as I feel this 500 cards of the books that are there, I'm a librarian. Those will be extinct very quickly, of course. That's clear.
Hi, I'm Lina Akrolt, and I work as a librarian here for the astronomers. And I just have to say that we already do that because in astronomy the huge research observatories, they all have librarians and data curators that manages their metadata and their data servers. And yeah, it's very successful. And so we are there, but what I think is that the other research disciplines needs to say that we need that structure for our discipline as well. Because
I agree, but also don't underestimate. If you go to high energy physics or astronomy, they have big data, but their data are extremely simple. I always tease my Dutch colleagues that their data are, we don't see anything, we don't see anything, we don't see anything. Oh, now we're too late. So, and that is, so for many years, this is a small group of 25,000 people around the world. They have very expensive machines. So by definitions, they had to work together and create fair data, as in reusable and understandable for their machines. But if you switch from astronomy or high energy physics to, for example, my field, the life sciences, it's a mess. You know, the people in genomics use different tesori from the people in metabolomics, from microarrays. You try to combine 5 microarrays in EBI, it's a nightmare. So it's much more complex than in high energy physics. That doesn't mean we cannot learn a lot from how you did your stuff right. So that is also what GoFair tries to do, bring these different communities together and say, look at how they did it, at least try to copy as much of the success stories and best practices to your discipline. So we want to learn a lot from you guys.
So, but you need to take the need for librarians and data curators with you in the applications for funding.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And a lot of the stuff is generic anyway, like security, encryption, all these things are reinvented 5 times over in different disciplines. That's a waste of time. So you have to talk more about that together. I actually have a small question to you. If you so when I was watching your presentation, I was waiting, and I'm sure you do this, to the point where all kinds of patterns in music and movements and dance and so on also become part of a thesaurus. You know, say if you see this pattern, that means somebody is making this particular dance move. Is there already a sort of thesaurus that when this is recognized again by the computer, it can automatically annotate a video or any recording with particular terms?
It's not there yet, but that's exactly what we're working on.
Yeah.
So, and our center now is working between musicology, psychology, and informatics. And the idea is to really develop these fairly large databases where you can do different types of machine learning on them,
Yeah.
etc.
And store it as machine-readable data.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's what we're working towards, with the help of many people sitting here as well. But one thing is the idea of these things, another thing is the practical implementation, which is
yeah, but I
see
see
daily life is
imaging also in the life sciences. They have these videos of protein trafficking in the cell and so on, and we are getting close to the fact that you can just run the machine over a long-term video of a cell culture, and it annotates the whole process virtually automatically with thesaurus terms. That doesn't mean it's always right, but people never come higher than 70% consensus as well. So it's already as good as humans. And then you can create very rich metadata on the videos and so on. That would be great.
So, Shishti? Okay, Francesca.
Hi, Francesca, service provider. I am always impressed by the concept of this cascade that will bring us directly into the internet of fair data in a couple of years or so. I always think that, as you also mentioned, the private business here is ahead as compared to the science, probably because they see the business part. There are some communities in the scientific world that are very much ahead, traditionally wise. But the long tail of scientists has vaguely the concept of fair. So do you think, what is the best way to catalyze this cascade and include them as well?
Let me first, I'm always a bit allergic to terminology, as you know. So I don't want to put private as opposed to science. Let's say academics and public sector to private sector, because take data science. If, as Tony Hayes said recently, for every data scientist that is there in the public sector, the big 5 have 10,000. So they will lead the science in the data. Okay, that's so science is not opposed to private, but I think you mean the private sector versus the public sector. Okay.
Exactly.
So the only thing I can say, of course, it's impossible to predict what is going to happen in the Internet of Fair Data and Services. Small anecdote, when George Strawn said to his boss, shall we ask $10 back for every domain name the company is allowed to give out, and they were connecting 100 universities, his boss said, are we ever going to give out more than 100 domain names? Oops. They would be billionaires if they would have sustained that. So we will not know what happens when machines get loose on the internet for machines. Science will be completely different from what we know today. When the internet started to boom, there were not even smartphones. 10 years ago, there were not smartphones. So who would have predicted today's situation? No one. And how social sciences use smartphones with automatic GPS location and so on. So, first of all, there's no prediction how the long tail of science will jump in. What we know for sure is the moment that, well, not for sure, but what we know is based on this article, on common patterns in the development of new infrastructures, once there is this converger, it will boom in such a way that, of course, the big sciences will take the lead, but the long-tail sciences, unless they want to die, will follow. So I was talking to an archaeologist recently, and she said, yeah, but we need to know exactly where we found this little thing. I said, well, but when you do, you will have your smartphone there, won't you? Yeah, but there is no thesaurus for all locations in the world. I said, yes, there is. It's a GPS location. So people don't even realize yet all the abilities that are there, that if you find something anywhere and you have your smartphone there, you know where you are. And it's automatically registered. And this will be all very easy to make it fair. But in some cases, there is an actual resistance against machines coming in because they really believe they should keep sitting and, you know, doing these things. But if you look at the biodiversity people, in Naturalis alone in the Netherlands, they have 52 million samples, and they are almost done with annotating them with fair metadata. Even the oldest butterflies they have. And suddenly they open up this incredible new area of research. And that's only one example. We will get like millions of new ways of doing science, even in the long tail, that is not predictable. I would be, you know, who would predict today in 1990, when the internet was 100 universities being able to send some messages? That's a few decades ago. There's no way to predict what the next big wave will be. If machines start to use the internet as end users, you know, it's dazzling what will happen. We will see an endless number of patterns. Mark Wilkinson, the first author, has this graph that shows the distance, the time difference between an invention and its application. And there's a wide variety between drugs and software, but the regression line goes down. You know, when it passes the zero, if it's a straight line, maybe it goes a little bit like this, 2025. You read Homo Deus. According to this graph, in 2025, there is no time lapse between a discovery and the application. And the only way I can imagine that is machines will have taken over. And they have calculated all the risk, like they played 1 billion Go games and nobody can beat the computer anymore. So they just implement what they found out. And if algorithms take over, who cares about humans? We will keep them in a zoo. No, really, I mean, this is not a joke. In a few decades, machines may rule the world. And we are just obsolete. I'm not joking, huh? The only thing they can do, in my view, is try to follow the industry and prevent that they take over and create 5 new Elsevier's, and make sure that the interest of the public sector is preserved in the Internet of Fair Data and Services. They don't have to build it. It will be there very, very soon. The big ones are moving in. And they're sitting at a table to set the fair, you know, the minimal standards. It is happening all around us. The EOSC in that sense is already far too late. So they have to safeguard the interests of the public sector. That's all they have to do. They don't have to build anything. It's happening.
Liva Kvalle. I work with research data. My concern here is a little bit what Jirti spoke about regarding consent and how complex it is when you ask for certain consents and not others, and you get some consents from there and there. And with this future artificial intelligence solving everything, how can we use computers or artificial intelligence or whatever to solve the issue of the complex consent situation whenever dealing with human subjects, and we have to have the GDPR in our head.
Would you want to say something first about the GDPR or not?
I can wait.
Well, I don't want to monopolize this here, but okay, I'm the guest. So I gave a lecture recently on GDPR and AI. First of all, I said AI doesn't exist, but okay, let's say machine learning. My feeling is that the distributed learning is also a potential solution to informed consent and GDPR. So let's stick to the personal health train, but it could be farmers, could be anything. If I have all my health data or my personal data in my personal locker in fair format, and I decide who can do what with the data, okay? Of course, if trains get loose, I could get 5 million requests a day on my smartphone. I don't want to say yes or no 5 million times a day. So I either retract from it, or I give my consent in proxy to my patient society. I'm a diabetic. I say, if my patient society says yes to a certain virtual machine that comes from the pharma, fine with me. Or I give it to my hospital. So you will get stacked informed consent by proxy. And you can also say, and only for these purposes. So we actually have a sort of matrix where you say, this is where I want to be. And then people, let's say in your video cases, if people say, yeah, you can reuse my video for educational purposes, but not in public, you know. If the machine knows that it can take this video and do machine learning on it, that's fine, but it cannot be shown in public. That can all be in the machine-readable metadata. So you will get a pretty natural ecosystem of informed consent by proxy.
Could I just add on?
Sorry.
Because, as I said, everything is actually relying on those consent forms. If you don't have it, it's really, really hard if you have a huge data corpus to use them purposely in the next, at the next stage. So you have to design for that very carefully. But also, you know, like the data we have, they could be used for very different purposes. You can't even imagine how we could use them. So there should be some sort of latitude here in how to use these data. But I think also another problem is linked to, you know, this pressure on accessing the informants afterwards. And then, for example, digital consent form has been introduced as a solution. But to some degree, I'm concerned about, you know, they have too much information linked to one sort of certification. So you use the bank ID as way of also accessing your data, and then everything is on that ID. And I'm skeptical on that one. So I think, but at the end of the day, I think all this is again going back to having a system for meta tagging. Otherwise, because, you know, then you can have information about, you know, those who are not willing to use the data in that and that purpose, embargo issues, those who are like red or black informants, all that could be linked to the metadata solutions as in the, but we are not there yet. And that was actually my comment. Why are we, everybody's talking about metadata, but nobody's, I'm sorry, but at least very few are doing something about it.
Yeah. And also, you know, when they asked Tony Brooks, the biobanking guy recently was in a full room, said, how do you deal with privacy? He said, we don't, get used to it. Anyone who promises you to protect your data is just lying. There is no privacy anymore. That's gone. And you can close your eyes for it and say, oh, no. I am, everybody, you know what Google knows about you more than you do. So that time has passed and people ignore that. Also people say, oh, we will still use hard disks in 5 years from now. Come on. We double our data every 6 months. We know hard disks will not be able to deal with it. We can store the entire internet on 1 kilogram of DNA. I can store all genomes in the world in my little finger here. 7 billion cells. So we will store data in DNA in a few years from now. We won't sequence people anymore, because if we sequence them, where do we store it? In DNA. Why would we sequence? So in 5 years from now, reading DNA will be so fast that we use that as a storage mechanism. So much for hard disks. And of course there's people say, no, this will not take place. That's the same people that said, I will never have a smartphone. What a crazy idea to be always reachable. You have the videos still from people saying, no, I will never have one. There's more smartphones than people. So come on. People that resist this, you know, that's fine if you don't want to do it, but it's happening.
But it's balanced with research ethics and what you promise. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So, but it's much better to have proper rules for what people are allowed to do with your data than say that you can protect them because you can't. So in the Netherlands, for example, they said, okay, I don't want to share my genome because my insurance company may increase my premium because they find this risk gene. If there is a law in the Netherlands, like in Estland, where you say, no, you will not be allowed to increase premium based on genome data because people cannot change their genome yet very easily. So then people will, their concern to share their data with the insurance companies goes to almost zero. And the patients are screaming to reuse their data. And then the doctors say, no, I cannot do it. No, the people say, use my data, maybe I get a cure. So there is this strange discussion around privacy, which doesn't exist anymore, that irritates me a little bit. And especially the people that say, we will protect your data. Forget it.
We should bring you to our National Data Protection Office.
Yeah. They'll kill me, maybe.
Yes.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I'm pretty sure we could have kept it going for another hour at least. But we're running out of time, so we're going to have to end it there. I would like to thank Professor Barend Mons for taking the time and coming here to talk to us. It's been very interesting.
It was a pleasure.
Good. Thank you, Alexander Jensenius and Kirsti Klette, for sharing your experiences from your own research. I would like to thank the Science Library for organizing everything. Merete, you've done a great job. And thank you all for being here today. I hope you found it interesting. And because it's December, I'm going to say Merry Christmas.